am a professor of economics at the University of California in Berkeley. So I was a student in France in mathematics, and then I moved to the US to do my PhD in economics at MIT. And then after that I went to teach at UC Berkeley, so I've been in the US now for about 15 years. My field of specialty is public economics and income inequality. So public economics means the role of government in the economy, and obviously income inequality is one of the biggest criticism you can make to a free market economy. They generate growth, but they also generate substantial inequality, and there is therefore room for government intervention to reduce income inequality through a vast array of programs, taxation, but also transfer programs. Actually, all governments do play a very large role in shaping income inequality. Jointly with other researchers, and in particular Thomas Piketty, who works in Paris, we've been studying top incomes in a number of countries over the long run using tax statistics. So those statistics are very good to be able to see what share of income goes to the top of the income distribution over long time periods. So Thomas Piketty started this study with France, then we studied the US, and since then we've studied a very large number of countries. So to summarize the findings very quickly, what do we find? We find that all countries, all advanced countries today that have been studied at very high levels of income and wealth concentration a century ago. That level of income concentration fell dramatically in the first half of the 20th century, in particular following the Great Depression, the economic turmoil, and then the war. And following those big shocks, pretty much all governments of those rich countries put in place very redistributive policies, in particular very progressive income and wealth taxation, as well as very strong regulation, in particular regulation of finance. So that made the income deconcentration that happened following those shocks permanent for decades. Now, what has happened in the last 3 or 4 decades has been the following: that is, in a number of countries, and in particular the English-speaking countries, the US being the leading one, there has been an increasing of that income concentration that had been low for decades. It had come back up, so that today in the US the top 1% income concentration is as large as it was about a century ago. But what's interesting about this phenomenon is that it hasn't taken place in all countries. As I said, it's in the English-speaking countries. Other countries from continental Europe or Japan haven't seen nearly as much of an increase. There, top incomes have increased a little bit, but not nearly as much, so that you really have a big divergence between the English-speaking countries and those other countries. Indeed, in the United States, which is a country that has a high tolerance for inequality, especially following the Reagan Revolution, where the thinking is the rich get richer. It's great because it stimulates the economy. Finally, the US has realized that this enormous increase in income concentration has its problems. In some sense, it's been so large that if you remove the top 1%, you realize that the economic performance of the bottom 99%, which is the vast majority of American families, has not been that great. So that's why inequality has been on the map, and you can see it actually, in the debate today. There is the fiscal cliff debate between Obama and the Republicans, and the core of the debate is really, are we going to tax the rich more or not? And it's central because, as I said, the income concentration in the US is so high now that there is now indeed potentially a great fiscal reserve there, and so the question is whether the US is going to tap into it. So now, in the case of France, so France first doesn't have nearly as high a level of income concentration, and yet it is the country that seems to have adopted the most radical reform, with the famous 75% tax on top incomes above 1 million euros in France. But what I would say, though, is that if you want to be serious about taxing the rich, you have to do it in a smart way. And the first rule there is that if you want to increase the tax burden on the rich, you need to do it in a way that cannot be easily avoided or evaded. Okay, so that's why you first need to have a really broad base for income taxation. And that's not, unfortunately, the direction that France has taken. France has chosen, a very narrow base of only labor income. It's a tax that's going to last only 2 years. So it's not going to be very effective in the sense that people are going to be able to evade or avoid. I think France would have been much better off broadening the base first and having rates that were much more moderate, so that they wouldn't generate as much tax avoidance. So this is an important question, and it really depends on the view you have of the economy. That is it a good thing or a bad thing to tax the rich? That really depends on how the economy functions. In principle, economists like myself and colleagues would be able to tell you the answer, but we don't. We haven't proven it in a way that is fully convincing. But if you have the Reagan view that the rich work hard and produce, and they are paid their value, and they need to be motivated with high incomes, high rewards, it's not a good thing to tax top incomes. If you have the alternative view, that is exemplified in the US by the Occupy Wall Street movement, that the rich have been gaining at the expense of the bottom 99%, then it becomes actually a very desirable thing to put high taxes on the rich to prevent them, if you want, from extracting more resources from the rest of us. But you see that in that second view, there is an inherent, conflict, class conflict. You can call it. So, in some sense, I wish there were a way to tax more the top 1%, but it's the nature of things that they are never going to like higher taxes on them. So we shouldn't, I think, worry too much about whether the rich, like it or don't like it, because obviously nobody likes taxes. What we should worry about is whether taxing them is damaging or not to the economy. And that's the key debate today among economists. That is, do the rich really are paid, what they contribute, and are they, fundamental, and are we going to hurt their motivation by taxing them? Or are they, in contrast, in a position of power to extract, and we need to put, regulations in the form of taxes, etc., to prevent them from extracting ever more. Let me talk a little bit about the case of the United States. So we hear, and indeed we economists always teach that in the long run, economic growth trumps everything. That is, if you look over the very long run, like 2 centuries, standard of living have increased dramatically, multiplied by 5 or even a factor 10 since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So that's true in the very long run, and so that very long run view is often taken, and presented by conservatives as, under the expression, a rising tide lifts all boats. And that's true, over a 2-century period, but if you look at shorter periods, like a few decades, that doesn't seem to be the way the economy work, and it's most striking actually in the case of the United States, because if you look at the last 30 years, 35 years, what you see is that the top 1% has grown tremendously, while the bottom 99% incomes have grown very slowly. So the tide, from the last 30 years has lifted only the yacht, if you want, of the top 1% and not so much those of the bottom 99%. Now, if you go back the period before, that is the 35 years before, from 1930, from the Great Depression to the 1970s, it was exactly the reverse. That was the time where the bottom 99% were growing very fast, while the top 1% actually were growing very slowly. So it's striking in the US that you have exactly that reverse pattern. So it's not a tide lifts all boat, it's either a group really does well and the other doesn't, and the converse. So that's why that simple striking fact really suggests that indeed the distribution matters enormously, and gives credence to the way that look an economy can function in a way that it benefits the vast majority and not so much the top, or the reverse. In the US now is in that situation where most of the growth goes to the top 1%, and the feeling is that maybe it's time for the government to do something about it. I would say that the situation regarding income inequality is pretty bad now. I mean, it's as bad as it's ever been. So the hope is that in a country like the US, we'll start putting in the remedies that have been put at other periods. I was mentioning the Great Depression and the New Deal policies of Roosevelt. We have a level of inequality in the US that is so high that it seems like those remedies are called for now. The world is different in the sense that we are in a very globalized world now. So the US is a big country, but it's clear that international cooperation will be very important. You don't want to be in a situation where the rich can easily evade or avoid, high taxes through offshore tax havens, etc. So it's going to be an effort that will require international cooperation. Now, so that's for the US. In Europe, the threat to income inequality comes more, I think, from the enormous increase that we've seen in the wealth to income ratio. So what seems to happen in Europe is that there has been a very large increase in wealth, if you want, relative to income. That is, in contrast to the US, in a country like France, your economic well-being depends now in large part to whether you received substantial inheritances. Think about your parents bequeathing you, for example, an apartment in Paris. That puts you as a tremendous advantage relative to others, just because the cost of real estate in a city like Paris is just enormous. And that's a phenomenon you see in France, but in other countries like Italy or Spain have also had, wealth to income ratios that have increased dramatically. I mean, Thomas Piketty and Gabriel Zuckman have documented that. So at a time where we have deficit problems in Europe, the fiscal capacity lies perhaps precisely in the wealth, so through taxes on wealth, on real estate, but also financial wealth. There can be tapped into for fiscal reasons, but also for equality reasons, to make sure that inheritances and what you get from the previous generations doesn't condition the economic outcomes. Definitely, the regulation or deregulation of finance seems very related to the trends in income concentration. And actually, a colleague, Thomas Philippon, a French economist as well, who works at NYU, New York University, has done a fascinating study showing the joint evolution of the level of regulation of finance in the United States, along with the relative compensation of workers in the financial industry and profits from the financial industry. And it has a shape very similar to the income concentration I was describing, that is before the Great Depression. You have low levels of regulations and high pay, high profits share, in finance, and that declines dramatically precisely with the regulations of the New Deal in the 1930s, stays low, and then the regulation starts in the late 70s. They continue, of course, with Reagan and Clinton, and you see a dramatic resurgence of the share of finance and top pay, going to the financial sector. And exactly as we had the discussion before, it's an open question. Has this finance been good, for the economy? You can make the case here very strikingly that the deregulation of finance has played a key role in this Great Recession that we've been going through. It's certainly the fact, that the deregulation and the rise of the subprime mortgages has played a key role in at least the beginning of the financial crisis that has engulfed, half the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you.